So we'll jump right into talking about estimating beta, because that's the third part. Risk-free rate, market return, which gives us the expected market premium, and then the beta for the firm. Okay? Now, the beta for the firm, specifically, beta is the measure used to determine the systematic risk of the asset. And the systematic risk is our firm's exposure to risks that affect the entire market. Right? Now, we know that UPS has lots of idiosyncratic risks. They have lots of unique risks associated with their business. But when we talk about firm risk, we only talk about their exposure to market-wide risk, the risk that would affect every company, not just the risk that affects UPS individually. And that's because as an investor, right, we calculate this from the investor's perspective, which is the return perspective. From an investor's perspective, they should be diversified broadly enough that they have cushioned the unique risk of all the companies in their portfolio so that they are only subject to systematic risk. Okay? So that's why that's the only thing we use when we look at the expected return. Now, in lieu of trying to talk this out, I'm going to jump to an example here. And the example walks through beta, how to calculate beta, and how we use and think about beta inside of the model. Because beta is an estimate of the company's exposure to systematic risk, we shouldn't expect that exposure to be constant over time, particularly if the company is going through any large-scale changes. Right? So here we can look at a graph of IBM's beta over the period from 1985 to 2010. And in that period, IBM experienced a significant change. They shifted from being primarily a hardware-based company that sold the physical computers and the physical servers and all the associated parts of IT for a company, to being primarily a service-based company. They started to sell computing space, they started to sell computing power, they started to sell server space, and now they do a lot of cloud-based operations and things like that. And so what happens when you make a big change is that your exposure to the market-based risk might change too. So let's think about what happened here. So you can see that IBM in the early part of the graph in the 80s and 90s had a historically lower beta than they do in the later part of the graph in the 90s and 2000s. And that distinction is almost entirely driven by the way they shifted their business. So you can see that the beta for IBM when they were primarily a hardware business was pretty low. It was less than 1. It was 0.8 to 0.4 at some points. Now, the reason is that a hardware type business is typically associated with lower systematic risk. And that's just usually because of the way that the business of selling physical products works. If my computer breaks and I need a new one, I gotta buy one, regardless of the economic cycle. But it's also that my purchases of computer hardware don't really change with economic cycles. I don't buy more computers because times are good or less because times are bad. I just buy the number of computers I need. I give every employee a computer and I move on. Right? There might be some distinction that I have more employees when times are good or less employees when times are bad, but in general, my service is not expected to shift significantly with market shifts. And so that's why we see a beta lower than 1. A hardware-based IBM reacts less to general market trends than the average firm in the market. And that's what beta means. But then when they shift to being primarily a service-based company, we see a big shift in their beta, up to about an average of 1.5. Now what happens here? Well, it's that a service company is the opposite. A company that is primarily selling a service is expected to be impacted by economic cycles and by economic risk factors. So a big hurricane or a war or just a general downturn in the market like 2008, and we would expect to see that IBM's service-based business would fall significantly. In fact, we would expect a service-based business to fall greater than the average firm in the market, simply because these are the first consulting or extra server space or things like that are the things that first get cut. Right? And then the things that get added on. If the economy is booming, I'm going to need more server space. I'm going to be more willing to pay for consulting. And so we see a big shift in beta. So we shouldn't expect the firm's beta to stay stable. It is relatively stable as long as the firm's doing the same thing. But as the firm shifts its general attitude towards business, we should expect the beta to shift too. So what this means is we have to recalculate beta every time we do this analysis to make sure that the beta hasn't changed. Okay. So a couple of best practices things here. And again, unless you're doing this, these aren't really I don't expect them to stick. But if you ever do these types of analysis, if you ever do need to estimate beta, come back here or at least know that there are things you need to look up, right? So important things, and I've given a lot of detail here, but the really important takeaways is we need to use as much data as we can. So I showed you in that example, what a regression for beta is actually doing mathematically. We just want to make sure that we use as many data points as possible. And so that means we want to look at as much of the historical return stream as we can, but with at least 60 data points. And that's just a statistical thing. The more data we have, the better our statistical estimate is going to be. Right? But we want to use monthly returns. You can use daily returns. I do it for different things, so it's not completely clear there. And you want to make sure that the market portfolio is a value-weighted, well-diversified portfolio. Okay. So I'm going to skip this measuring beta using peer groups. Again, that's more of an academic discussion on improving your beta. And jump into this. Okay. So we expect that a company's beta is going to be, again, relevant or in part determined by the industry that it operates in, or in part determined by the business that it operates in, whether that's the industry or not, right? And again, what's relevant here is how these firms should be expected to change when the economy changes, right? This is market-based systematic risk sensitivity. So if the market has a downturn of 10%, how do we expect our firm to behave? Are they immune to downturns? Are they immune to upturns, right? So if we think about industry-based risk, think about, say, like on one extreme, we could have grocery stores, Walmart. In a downturn, Walmart isn't that sensitive, right? In fact, we might think that Walmart would do better in a downturn because it's one of the cheaper grocery stores. And so people that might be now worried about being more money conscious might get priced out of a more expensive grocery store and go to Walmart. Right? So it's possible that it's there. But in general, we would say grocery store is not that sensitive to a market move because people buy food no matter what. They don't really buy less food when things are bad and more food when things are good. They might, to some extent, buy more expensive food and less expensive food, but that shift is a lot less significant, right? You could think about a company like Coca-Cola historically has a really low beta because if people drink soda, then they have a favorite, and if they drink Coca-Cola, because that's the best one, then they are not going to buy more when they get a raise. They're not going to buy less if they don't get a raise. Right? In a downturn or an upturn, you're just going to buy whatever you're going to drink. You're not going to stockpile Coca-Cola because the market's doing well. So it doesn't have a big beta because it doesn't react to systematic risk like the average company. Right? Whereas actually, you could think about a company like UPS being probably very close to the average, having a beta pretty similar to 1. And that would be because UPS is very tied to the economy itself. They deliver packages primarily, although they do this, they do have a big business in consulting and supply chain management and things like that, how to optimize your supply chain, which they have a lot of experience at, obviously. But if times are bad, people are ordering less things, less packages are getting delivered. When times are good, people are buying more things and more packages are getting delivered. And so we would expect them to vary pretty closely with the market. And then you got firms like, say, Google. Well, Google's primary income stream comes from marketing. right? That they sell ads. That's where most of their money comes from. Well, ads are very significantly with the market. Ads are usually the first thing cut when the market has a negative movement, and they're usually the first thing added back on when the market has a positive movement, as everybody piles in trying to get the customers that are buying again because the market's improving. So we expect a company like Google to have a really high beta. Right? And all that to be said is that we expect this based on the business, the industry that you're in. So we should expect industry betas to be relatively similar for firms within the same industry.